Welcome, fellow explorers. My name is Christian Alexanderson, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a podcast highlighting Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and great outdoors. Point State Park stands as the crown jewel of downtown Pittsburgh. It is a lush 36-acre green space nestled at the historic confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela Rivers, where the mighty Ohio River is born. Point State Park is a focal point for community gatherings, festivals, and celebrations. It provides sweeping views of the city's skyline and serves as a tranquil urban escape. It's a place where runners, cyclists, friends, and families converge, all drawn by its beauty and much appreciated open space in the busy urban landscape of downtown Pittsburgh. The Point has become the place you bring your out-of-town parents to. The place you see on TV during all home games for the Pirates and Steelers. The place you see from atop the iconic Duquesne Incline. But it hasn't always been that way. Before it was Point State Park, it was known as the Forks of the Ohio River and served as a critical military stronghold for the French, British, Native American, and American militaries. Fort Prince George, Fort Duquesne, and Fort Pitt were all, at one time or another, located where the state park stands. With the opening of the frontier, Pittsburgh became the gateway to the west. Over time, the Point developed into a thriving industrial zone, a place dedicated to supplying resources for the growing United States of America. But by the 1930s, the area had deteriorated into a commercial slum. City and state officials stepped up and completely changed the property. It would be designated on the National Register of Historic Places twice, and become a state park after nearly 25 years of construction. More than just a park, the Point is a testament to Pittsburgh's ability to reinvent itself while honoring its roots, and is a powerful symbol of Pittsburgh's resilience, history, and natural beauty. As the gateway to the city and the heart of its downtown, Point State Park doesn't just represent Pittsburgh, it is Pittsburgh. But before we learn more about the park, here's the stats. Point State Park is a 36-acre park located in Allegheny County. Available activities include hiking, biking, walking, picnicking, wildlife watching, boating, fishing, kayaking, and sightseeing. A notable feature of the park is its views of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio Rivers. Point State Park got its name because it sits at the confluence of major rivers. State lands that are close by include Allegheny Island State Park and Forbes State Forest. You may enjoy the park if you enjoy history and beautiful city green space. I'm excited to welcome Jack Lahendro to the podcast. Jack is the environmental education specialist at Point State Park. Jack, thanks so much for joining the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
How would you describe the Point to someone who's never been there before?
So Point State Park, it sits at the western edge of downtown Pittsburgh, and it's commonly referred to as the Golden Triangle. The Point itself is located at the confluence of three great rivers, the Allegheny River to the north, the Monongahela River to the south, and the Ohio River to the west. At only 36 acres, it is Pennsylvania's 12th smallest state park. By visitation, it is the fourth most visited, with over 1.5 million visitors passing through in 2023. You could ask anyone in Pittsburgh to meet you at the Point, and they would be there within an hour, depending on what parkway traffic is doing, of course. For any non-Pittsburghers out there, you have probably seen the Point before on TV. During almost every Steeler or Pitt Panther football game, the broadcast will show the Point eventually, typically with the fountain at full power and the city in the background. Additionally, most of the pictures that you see when looking up Pittsburgh on Google showcases Point State Park.
The Point has been an incredibly important area for not just Pittsburgh and the Commonwealth, but for our early nation. Can you speak about the historical importance of the Point?
Of course. So the importance of the Point is unequivocal, not just in the history of Pittsburgh or even the history of the United States, but also the entire world. So stick with me here for a minute, because this is going to be a bit of a long story. All right, so it starts thousands of years ago, and it starts with the three rivers and life being naturally drawn to the river for them to survive. If we go back really far, some of the first discoveries of human habitation in North America were discovered in western Pennsylvania about 19,000 years ago, just a short 30 miles from where the Point sits today. Many Native American nations lived in this area in the thousands of years before colonization, including the Monongahela, Lenape, Shawnee, and the Iroquois Confederacy. Most written word starts in the mid-1700s at the height of the French fur trade. There were a handful of French outposts scattered throughout the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys that facilitated an exchange of goods from across the world. North American beaver and deer furs were traded for spices and silk from Asia, or livestock and grains from Europe. As the trade and exploration of North America continued to expand, The leaders of France and Great Britain started tracing maps to figure out the best way to control the land and command the trade. In almost every single scenario, all fingers found their way to the forks of the Ohio, right here in Point State Park. For the French, they wanted this land to keep their fur trade at the top of the world and protect it from British interests. With established cities in Quebec, Montreal, and all the way south in New Orleans, there are about 3,000 miles of navigable rivers and lakes and only 4 short passages to travel on land for the French to control the Western Americas. For the British, control of this land meant more resources to acquire, more space to settle, and more colonies for the motherland. While they didn't have the advantage of easy travel by river, they actually had the opposite problem where they had to climb over mountains and streams and very hard, rough terrain. The British settlements in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Williamsburg provided closer access to the large ports, government oversight, and soldiers tenfold the size of French forces. So the story with this conflict, it starts in 1749, and the French made the first move. Celeron de Blainville led 250 French and Canadian soldiers and Native American guides down the Ohio River Valley to choose sites for French fortifications. Realizing that the loss of British trade would turn the native people against them, the French quickly built forts at Presque Isle, the portage on French Creek, and the confluence of the French Creek and Allegheny River by the end of 1753. About 2,000 French troops were being garrisoned to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio the following spring. However, 21-year-old Virginian was commissioned by the British to travel through the upper Ohio River Valley to tell the French that the land would be claimed for the king. On November 23rd, 1753, George Washington arrived at the forks of the Ohio and noted how well the land was situated for a military fortification. Washington continued to travel north to Fort Venango, where the French and British learned of each other's plans. On his return travel to Virginia, Washington was shot at and almost drowned, but managed to get word to the governor about the plan. On February 17th, 1754, the British named the first fortification at the forks of the Ohio Fort Prince George. It stood until April 17th, 1754, when French soldiers offloaded their canoes and pointed their cannons at the small fortification. The Virginians surrendered and were allowed to leave with their guns and some rations, but the point was now in French hands. Using the timber from Fort Prince George, Fort Duquesne was built in 1754, named after Marquis Duquesne, Governor General of New France.
The French built Fort Duquesne at the Forks in 1754, which gave them control of the Ohio Valley. What do we know about the fort and its importance during the French and Indian War?
Great question, Christian. So Fort Duquesne, it was the centerpiece for the French and Indian War. And the story starts again with George Washington. Yes, this is the same George Washington that is our first president. He was a lot more influential in the British Army during that early day in the French and Indian War. In late May of 1754, Washington was marching to the forks of the Ohio when they caught word that a French scouting party was nearby. Washington decided to ambush the party, killing 10 men and capturing the rest. He retreated south and built Fort Necessity in a meadow, hoping his forces could heal and recover from the Battle of Jumonville Glen. On a rainy July 3rd, 700 French and Native American soldiers hid themselves in the wood and fired upon Washington's forces. By the next day, July 4th, 1754, Washington signed a generous yet humiliating peace treaty that pledged to not return to the mountains for over a year. The Jumonville affair and the battle at Fort Necessity were considered the starting points for the French and Indian War. After the first few years, these conflicts in America eventually turned into the 7 Years' War, a worldwide conflict with Britain declaring war on France in 1756 and ending with the French surrendering in 1763 at the Treaty of Paris. Circling back to the forks of the Ohio, Fort Duquesne was the epicenter for the first part of the war. The British were still looking to control the rivers and west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the French were unrelenting. On July 9th, 1755, an eager French captain, Daniel de Bugeaud, took a small detachment of under 300 French, Canadian, and Native American soldiers south to ambush the approaching British army, about 1,500 people large, led by General Edward Braddock. And the conflict started where Turtle Creek meets the Monongahela River, about 9 miles east of Fort Duquesne. By the end of the day, Washington led the British retreat after suffering about 1,000 casualties, including General Braddock. Meanwhile, the French marched back to Fort Duquesne carrying the spoils of war, including Braddock's war chest, confidential orders, wagons, horses, cattle, artillery, arms, and a year's worth of goods to trade with the local native people. It was fairly quiet at Fort Duquesne for the next few years until September 14th, 1758. British forces were growing in the frontier forts, and a small dispatch were garrisoned to attack Fort Duquesne, led by James Grant. A few miles from the fort, Grant gave the command for the drums to announce the attack with his 400 men. Hearing the commotion, 800 French and Native American forces grabbed their weapons, snuck behind the British troops, and killed about three-quarters of Grant's men. Grant was captured after his failed attack, but lived to be a commander in the British Army in the American Revolution. He's also well known for being the British commander that only told the British Queen he needed about 5,000 men to quell the colony's uprising. And as we well know, that is not the case of what happened.
Just a poor estimation on his part.
Oh, very poor estimation. And he was actually that's partly how that battle failed so miserably. He vastly overestimated his forces and underestimated how many French and British were there. And because of this battle, so after winning this battle for Fort Duquesne, French soldiers were faced with a predicament. So thinking back, the battle happened in September of 1758. So we're reaching into the fall season. It's almost harvest time. Their Native American allies asked and were granted permission to head back to their villages for the fall harvest and hunt, leaving the fort garrison with only 400 men, little food, and no hope of reinforcements. With 22,500 British soldiers on the way, the French decided the best course of action was to take all their gunpowder, extra munitions, explosives, and anything else that would burn, place it in every corner of the fort, and obliterate it, while the extra supplies and prisoners went west to the Illinois and Indiana country, and the captain and most of the men went north along the river back to Marshall, which is now known as Franklin, Pennsylvania. British soldiers camping about 12 miles away heard explosions and awoke the next morning to a cloud of smoke on the west. On November 26, 1758, the British officially rose their flag over the remnants of Fort Duquesne, naming the town Pittsburgh. The soon-to-be-built fort, Fort Pitt, was named after William Pitt, Secretary of State for War.
When we're talking about the size of Fort Duquesne, what do we think the dimensions were?
So the size of Fort Duquesne, it was a pretty small fort. At Point State Park today, you can actually see a granite outline, but not in the same way that you can see it 270 years ago. So part of the architecture of the park includes granite outlines where the fort once stood. Fort Duquesne is found on the Great Lawn, and it is closest to the fountain and is a four-pointed star-shaped pattern. It's probably about, I would probably say about 100 feet on each side of the corner. So relatively a pretty small fort. It can only have about 150, 200, maybe 400 men if you're really cramming them all in there. So it's not a big fort at all, but just big enough to defend the area, hold the area, but have a good garrison there to make sure that the land is secure. However, Fort Pitt, on the other hand, that was a much, much bigger fort. You can still see it today in Point State Park, but it spans a much larger portion of the park. Two of the bastion outlines are designed in a granite outline, much like Fort Duquesne is. One of them is non-existent because of where the highway was built up when the park was being developed, but the other two are rebuilt and recreated as if they were 270 years ago. One of them is the Flag Bastion, which is located near the parking area, and the other one is the Monongahela Bastion, which is now the Fort Pitt Museum, which contains the Point State Park office.
Fort Pitt was built between 1759 and 1761 during the French and Indian War. It was the most extensive fortification built by the British in North America. Where can visitors learn more about this important military fortification at the point?
The best way to learn about the importance and significance of Fort Pitt is to come to the park and visit the Fort Pitt Museum. Inside, you can explore the events leading up to the French and Indian War, how the war developed, learn about the three main parties involved in the conflict, discover the outcomes that affected the colonies in America as a whole, and experience what life was like during the mid-1700s. The museum also manages a rotating exhibit that changes after a few seasons. Right now, the exhibit is Homelands, Native Nations of Allegheny. It provides an in-depth explanation of the history and culture of American Indian nations who once called Western Pennsylvania home. It takes a little over an hour to fully go through the museum, and I'd recommend take as much time as you can to get the most out of the exhibits. Beyond the museum, I'd recommend spending some time to explore the two granite bastions in the park, which can show you the scale of how large the forts were and how significant this place was in early American history.
You mentioned it earlier, the Great Lawn. What is the Great Lawn, and how do you see visitors using it?
So, the Great Lawn is a large grassy area that can be found on the fountain side of the park, and it is one of the most well-used areas of the park. On nice days, families will have picnics, students from local universities can be seen throwing a football or enjoying the sun, workers will take their lunch break and walk around the park, and kids are often learning how to ride their bikes or fly kites. On weekends, myself and the Fort Pitt Museum staff often do programs on the lawn, ranging from disc golf or lacrosse practice or history or nature programs. Point State Park also has a second lawn as well, and this is the city side lawn, which is a larger open space near the city entrance of the park. This is typically where Point hosts the events that come to the park, but the public will often use it to exercise their dogs, have recess or gym class, enjoy some fresh air, or just anything else just to get themselves outside. In general, the Point is the front yard for not just Pittsburgh, but also the thousands of people that live and work in the downtown area.
I know that there's monuments, plaques, and markers that are located throughout the park that commemorate the various events and people of historic importance at the forks of the Ohio. How can visitors find them?
The best way for visitors to explore the plaques and markers in the park is just honestly just slowly loop around the park, take your time, and try to read and find all of them. Most of them are located outside the Fort Pitt Museum entrance, as well in and around the blockhouse fence, but there are a few scattered by the fountain, near the pump house, in the woodland beds, in the Fort Duquesne outline, at the cafe, and near the parking area. The one I really would like to highlight because not a lot of people know about it is David L. Lawrence. It talks about his birth here at the Point when it was the slums of the city. He was able to get small jobs growing up to help support his family until World War I, when he joined as an officer stationed in Washington, D.C. When he returned to Pittsburgh, he eventually became the chair of the Allegheny County Democratic Party, eventually helping out with local, statewide, and presidential elections. In 1945, he became the mayor of Pittsburgh and was one of the first civic leaders to lead an urban renewal plan. That agenda formed the first renaissance of Pittsburgh, cleaning the city of pollution and creating Point State Park, in which Lawrence is remembered today.
Jack, what do you love most about the park?
So, probably the thing I love most about the park is the passion that people show for this place. As one of, if not, the most iconic place in Pittsburgh, it's clear how much people care about these small 36 acres. We're always hearing about the ways we can improve the park, but we see how Pittsburghers care about this place when they visit. I've witnessed people use this place as a meeting area, as a first date location, as a last date location, and as a place they just feel drawn to. Even for me, growing up just outside of Pittsburgh and being a regular visitor to the city, I count myself incredibly lucky to be working here and trying to make the park a better place for everyone. As a physical connection to the park, something that we can actually touch and see here at the park, the thing that I love most is the woodland beds. These woodland beds, they surround the Great Lawn, and it's just a nice, awesome way to explore nature in a city area. These woodland beds are filled with over 50 native species of trees, flowers, and other plants that are extremely beneficial for the birds, insects, and mammals that depend on them, but also for the people that may not realize the benefit that they're receiving from being among the trees. It's that small slice of forested paradise in a busy urban area, and I always love to remind myself the wonders that can be found there when the omnipresent noise of traffic, trains, people, or work seem overwhelming.
I think one of the things I love about the Point the most is that it's a great display of the diversity of parks that we have in Pennsylvania. It's like you can go to the Cook Forest and you could find your ancient trees, or you could go to the Point and find your history and your beautiful water. Is that something you really enjoy about it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So, one thing that a lot of people I don't think understand about state parks is it's more than just nature that we try to conserve. Part of the mission of Department of Conservation of Natural Resources is to conserve both the natural history and the historical artifacts that we find in our parks and in our natural areas that we have. So it goes beyond just conserving the natural areas that we can find, especially here at Point State Park. But it goes to the historical parts as well. And that's something that we often forget when we're in our parks is what type of history has played into making this place both into a park, but how does the history go into that as well? I know you've talked about it on previous podcasts and previous episodes of how these different areas or how these different parks are made and how they come up. CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, is a very common theme. But Point State Park is very, very different. I think only the Buchanan Birthplace State Park is one of the few other parks in the state of Pennsylvania that has such a deep historical connection. Washington Crossing as well. And to have these parks and have these conserved areas for the historical preservation, it's awesome to have. But on the flip side of that as well, to keep these areas around for the natural preservation as well, especially in these urban areas where not a lot of people have time to be exploring in nature. I think that's one of the most important reasons why Point State Park is a park in itself, is to show people that this is nature. Even if it might not seem like nature, you can still feel that nature. You can still be around nature, even when being in an urban area.
Yeah, and it certainly provides that connection to nature. If you're growing up in a city and you don't have the ability or the accessibility to be able to travel very far, you can still experience water and trees and really beautiful scenery still in the same city that you grew up in.
Exactly. Yeah. And as an environmental education specialist, I often try to do nature program. I try to focus my efforts on nature programs to help people reach that point. And one of my favorite programs I love to do is nature journal. What I do is I take a picnic table, put it on the grass underneath a large oak tree, and I just sit there for the better part of an hour. And I have a topic that I come up with before I get there. And my topic that I'm discussing with these people is I've talked like one of the ones I did was about Rachel Carson. So talking about her story, the Pittsburgh native that because she was born here and saw how horrible the steel industry was to the natural area, that eventually led her to write the book Silent Spring. And now we have a lot of environmental regulations and chemical industry changes that resulted from that book. She was born right here in Pittsburgh, and not a lot of people know about that. They know the bridge, there's the Rachel Carson Bridge, but not many people know her story. So my nature journaling program is to allow people to take that time, remember that they're still in a city, and like have them think that, okay, I'm still in a city, but I'm still finding these areas where these large natural impacts have been made, especially through people like Rachel Carson or talking about the fall leaves. So that's why it's one of my favorite programs to do, because it's such a great way to get people immersed in nature and focused. If it's 20 minutes or a full hour, however long they want to come, I welcome them to come down, just sit with me and draw and just explore nature in a very specific, focused way.
And now, let's hear from our sponsors. Join the Keystone Trails Association's trail care team to show some love to the trails you love. KTA organizes hands-on stewardship events and training workshops to maintain and expand hiking trails in Pennsylvania. You can find a trail care event near you. Check out KTA's schedule of events online at kta-hike.org. Are you looking for your next adventure? Unlock some of the best landscapes in Pennsylvania with incredibly detailed, highly curated, waterproof trail maps from the folks at Purple Lizard. They create extraordinary maps of Pennsylvania state forests for people who love to explore the outdoors. Find them at your local outfitters, bike shops, and bookstores, or visit purplelizard.com, where your next adventure begins. Refresh your love of Pennsylvania state parks and forests this spring with the Pennsylvania Parks and Forests Foundation. Stay in the know by finding events on Meetup or their website, signing up for the weekly e-newsletter, following them on social media, joining a local friends group, or accessing resources online at paparksandforests.org. Together, we can help conserve Pennsylvania's natural resources, support education, and remove barriers to an inclusive outdoor experience for everyone. Looking for a way to add some local Pennsylvania flair to your space? Check out Sister Sunflowers. They create unique stickers inspired by small local spaces that make your community shine. From quirky caves to hidden local gems, their stickers bring your favorite places to life. Perfect for your laptop, water bottle, or anywhere that needs a little hometown love. For both locals and visitors, there's stickers, magnets, prints, and more celebrating Pennsylvania's most iconic parks and forests. And for more avid explorers, there's even a hand-drawn poster to keep track of the Pennsylvania state parks and forests that you've been to. Use code HELLBENDER15 at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Support local, inspire adventure, and decorate with meaning, only at Sister Sunflowers. Shop now and celebrate the places that make your town special. All right, back to the show. One of the most beautiful aspects of the point is that it sits at the confluence of three rivers, How do you see visitors enjoying the rivers, whether on land or by sea?
Yeah. So park visitors can be seen utilizing the water almost year round, with most people avoiding the rivers in the wintertime. However, winter is one of my personal favorite times of the year to watch the rivers. As an avid bird watcher, watching the rivers from the point for migrating gulls, ducks, and geese is something I try to keep up with as much as I can. Another phenomenon to see with the rivers in the winter is to truly see how different they are. When it starts to get cold enough, especially in the northern parts of Pennsylvania, icebergs start to form on the Allegheny. As they float south, they pass by the point into the Ohio River. However, because the Monongahela River comes from the south where it's ever so slightly warmer, I've seen open water flowing from that river meeting the icebergs on the Ohio. So it's really cool to see the two different rivers merging together and kind of forming like two separate paths into one river, which is such a cool phenomenon to see. But also, and as winter starts to slow down and the snow starts to melt, rain start to pick up, the rivers start to accelerate with extra water, and that creates an entirely different phenomenon. Historically speaking, the Allegheny River has a rocky bottom with swift moving waters, while the Mon River was much different, with a muddy bottom, slow moving, and pretty shallow. On days after a good rain, you can see the muddy bottom of the Monongahela River start to get mixed up and start to flow down the river, meeting the dark green waters of the Allegheny. And when this happens, it becomes this distinct ground green or brown waters meeting green waters, distinctly separating, meeting together at the point, and then starting to flow down the Ohio River, mixing together. And that's one of the coolest things that I see here at the point during the wintertime. So even a period that we don't typically think about being in the water and enjoying the water, we can still see those really cool phenomena that you don't typically see in nature all that often.
Jack, what are people's reactions when they see that?
Um, that's a great question, actually. Uh, Most of the time it's just an awe and like, how does that happen? Honestly, I remember the iceberg incident specifically. I remember seeing that when I was young. I don't remember exactly how old, but I was in the Carnegie Science Center, which is just across the river from the point. So I remember seeing icebergs flowing down the Allegheny and then the Mon River just being completely clear. But the icebergs they would stay on the side of the Allegheny River first. So it's almost like the current would be coming down. The current would keep going before it got mixed in with the current from the Mon. And it just takes a while for those two to merge together. But as far as like the reaction of people, it's kind of just one of those marvels of like, how does that happen? How are these natural phenomenon around us? And that's something that just we love doing in state parks is trying to teach those natural phenomena. So showcasing stuff like that and just asking the questions, it's all part of that learning process. And you can learn at any age, uh, whether you're in grade school, high school, college, um, post college, or even an older retired beyond work, you're always learning and seeing these really cool phenomena and just asking questions. That's the best way to get to learn and the best way to reach people. And I'd be happy to try to figure out that answer if anyone out there wants to know more.
Well, you just taught me something, so I'm glad.
Yeah. Going back into how the people like the water. So winter, obviously, not a lot of people are in the water. It's really cold. Do not swim in the water in the winter. Please
Yeah.
do not. In the spring and fall, though, that's when most people are typically in the water, but more from the edges. So in Point State Park, I often see people fish on the edges of the wharves as the fishing season opens. Typically, I see them catch bass, catfish, carp, freshwater drum, or any type of panfish. In the summer, usage of the water really starts to pick up. Fishing along the wharves is still very common, but people start to enjoy their water in their boats is a daily occurrence. Jet skis, pontoon boats, kayaks, fishing dinghies can all be seen from dusk to dawn, with many a person swimming in the water from the boats and just hanging out in the nice cool waters. As a visitor to Pittsburgh, one of the best ways to enjoy the rivers is to do a Gateway Clipper cruise, which is a short trip and history tour around the waters. Unfortunately, it is not part of Point State Park. It's a completely separate business, but it's not far from the point. However, the boats do take you down the Monongahela River. You'll pass by the view of Point State Park, and it really is one of the best ways to both see the city and see the park from the rivers itself.
What will visitors see if they take a walk along the park's paved promenades?
So, walking the park's trails is a great way to enjoy the city in a park setting. So, when walking on the Monongahela side of the river, a beautiful view of Mount Washington, the Fort Pitt Bridge, and the Duquesne Incline are featured. On the Allegheny side, PNC Park, Acrisure Stadium, the Science Center, and other North Shore destinations are the eye catchers. And even on days where there's a football game or a baseball game, you can often hear the announcements from the stadium when walking within the park, which is a really cool thing to experience. While in the inner parts of the park, you can take in the urban forest and the sounds of squirrels and birds that you would generally hear in any other state park. But the premier view that a park visitor can take in can be found at the very tip of the point with the iconic Point State Park fountain.
The fountain is one of the most beautiful visuals at the park. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, of course, Christian. Uh, Fountain is probably the one thing I get the most questions on of what is here at Point State Park. So this is something that like the fountain is the icon of Pittsburgh. And the initial idea for the fountain was conceived in 1945 when Charles Stotts and Ralph Griswold, the architects for Point State Park, started their designs with a fountain sketch at the focal point of the park. There were many ideas that spawned in the initial plans, including Joe Magarac, an urban steelworker legend that would be pouring water or what would be liquid steel into a furnace, and that would be the design of the fountain. However, just to make things a little bit easier, Stotts and Griswold wanted to create something large enough to stand out among the skyscrapers, Mount Washington, and the three large rivers. Because thinking about it and thinking about how you see the city of Pittsburgh from a from an overall image, typically the photos they're from a higher vantage point because of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
So to have that large mountain, that large vantage point, and these large skyscrapers that are 3, 4, 500 feet tall, and then also three huge rivers, the largest one being the Ohio at 6, 700 feet across. You need something to have that large significance presence, and that's what they wanted to make. And the final product, which is what we see today, it first started running on August 30th, 1974. So we just celebrated the 50th anniversary this year. It was a 150-foot monumental column surrounded by a 200-foot pool to catch the water as it fell back to earth. On the Monongahela side of the park, the building that you can see is the pump house, which is the heart of the fountain. Inside hosts state-of-the-art technology to control this wonder. Three 150 horsepower pumps control the central column, launching water into the air up to 150 feet. Another pump controls the three peacock fans that flank that central column, and a fifth pump takes the water in the infinity pool and pulls it back into the pump house to start the cycle again. There is a reservoir about 100,000 gallons that sit beneath the pump house, and the pumps can cycle over 1 million gallons every single hour.
Wow.
There is some water that does get lost in the wind, so it does need replaced eventually. To do this, we pull water from the mythical underground Fourth River of Pittsburgh. While it's not a true river, like you can't go kayaking down it or go exploring it, it's actually just an aquifer that runs all year round, about 57 feet below the surface. It is a near constant flow of water, but it lacks the contaminants that can be found in the three rivers, making it the best source of water for critical fountain mechanics. So aside from it being just the landmark structure of Pittsburgh, the fountain represents more than just the city, but it's the reason why Point was built here as a park in the first place. So the point, there's three reasons and three things that the fountain represents. It's the point of conflict. And this goes to the initial conflict that took place here between the French and the British, the Native Americans and the British, the steel industry and the unions, and the political conflicts and the compromises that developed the point into the park it is today. The fountain also represents the point of confluence, where the three rivers meet. But the park is more than just where rivers meet. It's a place where people meet for events. They meet here for first dates, weddings, retirements, and anything in between. The point is the place in Pittsburgh for its people. And finally, the fountain also represents the point of renewal. Throughout history, water has been closely tied and closely related to cleansing and new life, and the fountain is no different. Throughout the 1800s and 1900s, Pittsburgh was one of the worst cities to live in at all. Air quality was terrible. Only catfish and carp could live in the rivers, and the confluence of the rivers at the point were known as the slums. In the 1940s and the 1950s, Pittsburgh leaders came together to propel the city into its first renaissance, with Point St. Park and the fountain being the final project. Today, the fountain still represents the renewal of the city and the renewal of life.
As you've mentioned, the Point was once a busy industrial zone that had deteriorated into a commercial slum by the 1940s. What sort of work has been done over time to make the Point now a National Historic Landmark?
The point has seen almost any change you could imagine in the 270 years since the French first built Fort Duquesne. It's been anything from ranging from native undisturbed plants, battlefield, railroad tracks, steel mills, lumber yards, exhibition and music halls, roller coaster origins, bridge endpoints, construction sites, and where we are now. First, full circle back to native plants and a usable area for everybody, and construction. The construction feels like always happening here.
Of course.
It's because of these many phases in time is why Point State Park is a National Historic Landmark. The city of Pittsburgh was built around the point and has expanded well beyond the Golden Triangle. But the history of Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne are the primary reasons why this is a National Historic Place, especially with the archaeological artifacts that have been discovered in the 1950s and early 2000s. The point, and Pittsburgh by extension, also served as the gateway to the western frontier from the 1700s into the mid 1800s, starting with Meriwether Lewis and his crew launching the famous Lewis and Clark expedition from Pittsburgh on August 31st, 1803. Jumping ahead to the 1930s, city planners looking to make the point into a National Historic Park ran into a few problems in an attempt to hand the land over to the National Park Service. Most notably, the need to purchase the land from private companies, recreating the topography of the 1760s and the forts as they once stood, and add flood walls to the rivers protecting the land, all stalled and in progress. The plan was shelved during World War II to make it a National Historic Park, but after the war, city and state officials partnered with local prominent businessmen to acquire the 36 acres that eventually became Point State Park and the National Historic Landmark as we know it today.
Jack, is there something everyone should experience when they visit?
Yes. To me, there's two things that every person should do when they visit Point State Park. First, everyone needs to experience the fountain. Not just see, but truly experience. Stand at the edge of the ring, feel the mist fall on your face, and sense the power and significance that the fountain represents. Learn that it's more than just a destination spot. Understand that it's a connection to Pittsburgh and the gateway to the West, and the hope that the future holds something bright as you face the Ohio River facing the sunset. Second, I'd recommend visiting one of the many small grassy areas in our woodland beds, or stop at one of the many benches in the shady, woody areas and just take a break. Whether it's a short picnic, a break while walking, or dedicated time outdoors, I'd like for every person that visits Point State Park to experience the connection that a city and a state park can have together. Enjoy the breeze, hear the birds, smell the grass and trees around you, and just take some time to take that break. In the hustle and bustle of the city, it's important to find that time for yourself, and there's no better place to do that than Point State Park.
Let's say a visitor wants to spend a full day exploring the park. What do you recommend they do?
So, as I've talked about with previous questions you've asked me so far, coming down to Point to see the fountain and to visit the Fort Pitt Museum are two of the most common things that people do when they visit the park and spend a day exploring the park. But I would definitely recommend to do both of those things. Beyond those, the coolest part of Point that I've yet to talk about is the Fort Pitt Blockhouse. It is the only building that remains from the original Fort Pitt, built in 1764. It is the oldest building built west of the Allegheny Mountains. When Fort Pitt was decommissioned in 1792, the blockhouse remained standing because it was already private property being used as a house. It remained a housing unit for the better part of 100 years until Mary Shenley deeded the blockhouse to the Daughters of the American Revolution of Allegheny County, who have preserved the historical structure since. Today, a docent hosts visitors on Wednesdays and Saturdays from about 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., teaching them about how the blockhouse has seen the growth of Pittsburgh around it. To me, I think this is the most fascinating part of Point State Park, and it's well worth coming down to look at, even if it isn't open. After a visit to the blockhouse, I'd recommend either bringing or renting a bike if you're spending a full day here at the park. With that bike, you can start at Point State Park and bike through downtown Pittsburgh, reaching Washington's Landing along the Allegheny River via the North Shore Three Rivers Heritage Trail. You could bike down to the Strip District via the Strip District Trail. You can bike over to Station Square in the South Side via another one of the bridges and trails in the city. Or if you're looking for a longer bike ride, you can go all the way to Washington, D.C. Here at Point State Park, it is one of the terminuses for the Greater Allegheny Passage. A long, mostly paved bike trail that connects Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. And it takes you across Pennsylvania mountains. It actually passes through Ohio State Park, and it meets up with the B&O Canal Path to take you all the way to D.C.
Would you say there's a best time or season to visit the park?
One of my favorite parts about Point is that there's no bad season to visit the park, but I'd say winter is the most underrated season. The fountain is turned off and it gets pretty cold with the winds coming off the river, so being outside isn't necessarily the best. However, the Fort Pitt Museum is open for you to explore, and there are few sights better than freshly fallen snow over the city looking from the edge of the point. Personally, though, I think fall is the best time to visit. On the warm October days, I love taking a walk around the park, looking at the vibrant leaves within the park, framing the skyline, and enjoying the yellows, reds, browns, and oranges complementing the city and bridges of black and gold. Fall is also football season, so the park has regular visitors over the weekends when games are going on. But I'm not going to underestimate summer as well, because it is great to be here in the summer. Seeing the native planting beds planted by our volunteers, those are in full bloom. You can experience the shady sidewalks, and you can explore some of the events that often take place here over the summer months.
What sort of events are hosted in the park?
So typically, Point hosts events from April through September. We have large events that can bring over 5,000 people to the park at any given time, such as the 4th of July, Juneteenth, the Pittsburgh Marathon, or the Pittsburgh Great Race. Medium-sized events can host anywhere from about 500 to 5,000 people and can be seen here with fundraiser walks. We host small events, which are anywhere from 20 to 500 people, which typically are weddings, reunions, or services. With our events at the park, we run a really tight ship when these events happen because of our status as a National Historic Landmark. To accommodate so many people trying to host stuff here, but also balancing the recovery of the resources and historical sites, each event has a required rest period before the next event can even start setting up. So if you'd ever like to host an event at Point State Park, such as a family reunion, feel free to call the park office and we'd be happy to provide you with our event application.
Do you have any tips for people who plan on visiting the park or any suggestions to make their visit as enjoyable as possible?
Yes, I do. So my first tip, parking is always the question I get asked by people that are trying to find us. Point State Park does have its own concessionaire lot along Commonwealth Place, and that's the typical place for people to park. If that is full, Gateway Plaza is only about a 5-minute walk away, and it also has abundant parking. Next, I'd say be prepared for some walking. While the park itself isn't necessarily that large, again, 36 acres and only not even half of that is sidewalks. There's actually less than that sidewalks, but there's not a ton of walking itself in Point State Park. However, it's really helpful if you bring those shoes or bring good quality tennis shoes, because if you're not exploring the park, you're probably going to go explore the city afterwards. So you're really going to want to make sure you have the right shoes for that. Also, bringing some water with you is helpful as well, but the cafe and Fort Pitt Museum sell water on the days that they are open. Another suggestion that I have to enjoy the park is to just slow down and really take it in. While yes, it is in the middle of the city, it is much more of a park than what most people realize. I'd probably say that the average person is in the park for 30 minutes, from the time they step in to the time they step out. Yes, there are exceptions, both longer and shorter visits, but even if people spend an extra 15 to 30 minutes exploring this awesome place in the city, they would get much more out of it. Finally, don't be afraid to stop by and check out if there's anything going on. Throughout the year, I try to hold environmental education programs in the park, and the Fort Pitt Museum will often hold living history programs on their lawn. Please, please, please stop by and check out what we're doing. Most of the time, we cooked up something pretty fun that also has an educational twist to it. We welcome talking to anyone that is willing to listen. So if you ever see something intriguing going on while you're here at Point State Park, please feel free to check it out. We'd be more than happy to have you stop by and talk to us and see what we're doing.
Jack, thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, Christian. Really happy to do this. We're excited to hear some feedback on this and see where this goes in the future.
I want to thank my guest, Jack Lehendro, for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Meta for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch at hemlockstohellbenders.com or you can click support this show in the podcast description to provide a monthly donation. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexanderson. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Matt Davis.